Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Anyway, it's a true pleasure to welcome Barbara Simons to Microsoft. Barbara was for many years a researcher at IBM in Almaden in San Jose, and also the president of the Association for Computing Machinery. And she has since retired to a small island community outside of Vancouver, the real Vancouver, BC. Yeah, I put retired in quotes because retired seems to be a euphemism for working harder just on different things.
And not getting paid.
And not getting paid, exactly. So yeah, I'm not sure about that trade-off. I'll have to be careful of that. During her latter time at IBM, and especially more recently, she's been doing a lot of work on elections, including co-authoring a book that just came out with Douglas Jones called Broken Ballots, and I forget what the subtitle is.
Will your vote count?
Will your vote count? It's not exactly. Okay, so good. I'm not missing it there. And she's got a lot of experience in the election realm and mostly things not to do. So she's going to tell us about them now.
Thanks, Josh. So actually, we're only on in Canada part-time now. We're most of the time in San Francisco.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I just want to make that clear because I didn't want somebody accusing me of not being a U.S. resident and talking about U.S. elections. I mean, that's actually a concern. So what is internet voting? We have to think about this because there is currently a big push for internet voting. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this topic, because a lot of election officials and non-election officials think that we should be moving to internet voting for a whole host of reasons. So one of the things that we like to emphasize is that there are kind of safe things you can do. And that includes posting a blank ballot on a website and downloading that blank ballot. So when people say we want to facilitate voting for overseas voters, this is what we recommend. What we do not recommend is sending a voted ballot over the internet or voting at a website, even just marking a ballot online. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that later. Sending a voted ballot as an email attachment. And the reason that I mention this separately is that there are a number of election officials who seem to think that email is not internet voting. I've actually heard of people saying that. And I'm not sure where they think email comes from, but they claim we don't do internet voting, we just do emails. Phone voting, a lot of phones now are used over the internet, although any kind of phone voting is not a good idea, and fax voting of any kind for a whole host of reasons. Okay. So I'll put up this I'll just leave that slide while they come in. Yeah, we were in the garage when it happened.
Okay.
So I just reviewed what's safe and what's not safe, and I assume you guys all know that anyway. So electronic voting, well, there was a 50-state report which was just released a couple of weeks ago, and I recommend it to anyone who is interested in these issues. It was produced by Verified Voting, Common Cause, and Rutgers Law School. And one of the points it makes is that there are 31 states in the United States that allow electronic return of voted ballots, primarily for military and overseas civilians. Only New Jersey, of those 31 states, requires paper ballot as well. And in many cases with these remote ballots, the paper ballot, if it's downloaded, for example, if they use a ballot marking device, or even if they don't, if it's mailed in or emailed in, the election officials will remake the ballots so that they can go into the optical scanners. And as you can imagine, there are all kinds of security issues with that process. Some states, as I say, use electronic ballot marking software, and that software which again would be downloaded from the internet and creates this problem with you're communicating with the server, may produce a barcode for automatic remaking, which again raises security issues because, of course, the voter cannot verify what's on the barcode. There is a ballot with the names, so if it's checked, then you don't have to worry about the barcode. That is to say, if election officials check it. But of course, one of the reasons for having the barcode is to minimize the amount of work. Anyway, remade ballots are not secure. This is just a map which you probably can't read, but trust me, the darker states all have some kind of internet or electronic remote voting. And this is from, you can get this on the verified voting website. So why is it unsafe? Well, there's a whole host of reasons. We won't have time to go over all of them today. First of all, attacks on the computer managing the election or the server, attacks on the voters' computers, denial of service attacks, insider threat. And by the way, a lot of people who talk about security, I know that's not true here, but when you mention insider threat, election officials sometimes get indignant and think that we're accusing them of being criminal, which of course we're not. But you have to be aware of the fact that there are all kinds of insiders in this process. And of course, it's impossible to audit a recount if there's no paper. Other issues, as I'm sure you know, are fake websites, spoofing and phishing, or false flag attacks, where you might want to make an attack look like it comes from some other country that you want to get the US upset with, you know, say Iran. I'm not going to go into those, but you can imagine, yes?
You seem to have omitted the biggest threat, which is, I have no idea who's standing behind you with a billy club, persuading you to vote correctly.
So you're talking about coercion and vote buying and selling. That's true for all remote voting, not just internet voting. Any kind of remote voting, someone could be standing behind you with a billy club. So I didn't mention it because it's not peculiar to internet voting. It's true of any remote voting.
You go to the US consulate and vote, and nobody is holding a billy club on you at that moment.
Yeah, but they don't have you voting from the US consulate in these cases. That's not an option at the moment. So I want to talk about the DC hack. So the DC hack, just a wonderful, it's one of my favorite stories. The Washington, D.C. Board of Elections and Ethics decided they wanted to have internet voting for military and civilians living abroad for the midterm election, which at that point, of course, was upcoming. And they actually went to a good group of people, the Open Source Digital Voting Foundation, which has very competent programmers working there. This is, I should say, many levels above most of the stuff that's produced for voting, as people who are involved in the field know quite well. However, because there were some good computer scientists working there, the computer scientists demanded that there be a pilot test conducted before the system went live. So that was agreed, and the test was announced and delayed. You can just imagine what it's like when you're trying to install some software by a deadline. Finally, it didn't begin until September 28th, 2010, with real voting scheduled to start 2 weeks later over the internet. So within a few days, the University of Michigan had successfully, completely taken over the system. And they were very thoughtful. They left a calling card, which was 15 seconds after you clicked Submit My Ballot in the pilot test. The University of Michigan fight song came on. And it's actually a great song. I've listened to it many times. It was, yeah. And by the way, there's a website you can still go to, Alex Halderman's website, and have this experience yourself. Now, what's interesting was that the election officials didn't know for several hours that their system had been subverted, even though the fight song had been thoughtfully left behind. And the only way they found out was that one of the people testing the system sent out an email posting saying, "Why am I hearing the University of Michigan fight song?" And then somebody said, "That's not supposed to happen." So they finally found out. But one of the things that's discouraging or disturbing about that part is that had this test voter not sent this email, they might not have found out for several days. And they knew it was a test, and they knew they could be broken into. What happens in a real election? I mean, this is, all of these things are very disturbing in terms of the implications for a real election.
By the way, I'll quickly mention people here. Alex was here 3 weeks ago and talked about this at the faculty summit. Great talk. The video is available if you want to see.
Oh yeah, it's really worth. Yeah, yeah.
And scary.
Yeah. So 3 days later, the digital vote by mail was canceled. Do people all know this? Should I skip through this? Oh, okay. 3 days later, the digital vote by mail. They called it digital vote by mail instead of internet voting because some of us had managed to give internet voting a bad name. So it's now digital vote by mail is what they used. Anyway, it was canceled. The voters could still download blank ballots, but they could not return the voted ballots over the internet. But that's not all. On October 5th, Alex announced that his team had penetrated the system and had gone live. They exploited a shell injection vulnerability that gave them complete control over the system. They could change already cast and future ballots. They could reveal the voters' secret ballots. They installed their calling card, and there's the link, which you can get later if you want. Here's an example of the ballot. And as you see, they put write-ins everywhere to make it clear that this was a fake ballot, that they had succeeded in subverting the election. I don't know if you can see that very well, but that's an sample. A sample rigged ballot. So, and then 3 days later, there was a DC hearing that had previously been scheduled where Alex was called to testify. And he said that since the beginning of the test, his team had control of the network. The default master password for the network had been unchanged. And they got the default from the manual, so they didn't have to do a lot of work. They could watch the network operators configure and testing the equipment. And they actually brought pictures from the video feed to the hearing. But since the security cameras didn't have passwords, they could watch what the operators were typing, including their passwords. They could have reprogrammed the switches to steal votes in a real election. They also observed attacks coming from Iran and China. Now, Alex thinks they were probably not trying to break into the system, but of course, we don't know for sure. What we do know is that these attacks are ongoing and would be happening in a real election as well, and who knows what the motivation might be. They defended the network by changing the passwords and adding others. So basically, they defended the DC network for the DC people. They also uncovered, and this was just serendipitous, I suppose, one of the files used to test the system contained the 937 invitation letters for the people, the real voters, who had signed up to vote, together with those voters' pins. So had they been black hats instead of white hats, they could have cast ballots for real voters in the 2010 midterm election, and no one would have known. Yes?
Sorry, can you clarify? Earlier you said they used like this shell injection, whatever,
Right.
and then this is
To
a
break
network
in.
thing. This is a second exploit? Or?
Yes.
So there was a problem with the original, like the source itself had an exploit, and then they also were able to take advantage of these default passwords.
Which they uncovered
Okay.
in the course of rummaging around the system. Right. In fact, what I was told by one of the people who worked on the system is that he's talked about the vulnerability being introduced by the election officials. I don't know to what extent that's true. But in any case, he was complaining that the election officials made their task worse, harder. But I don't know the details, so I don't want to go into that. So the impact is that DC is no longer using a web-based system for the return of voted ballots, although they still allow email attachments and fax returns. And other states have not learned from the DC hack. Other states are still trying to pursue internet voting in some cases. So I want to just discuss some of the various vulnerabilities. The first one is the server vulnerabilities, and I want to look at corporate and government examples there. So just quoting a few people who you would think the states might pay attention to. The FBI Director Robert Miller said there are only two types of companies, those that have been hacked and those that will be. And the former director of the CIA, National NSA, said the modern bank robber isn't speeding up to suburban banks with weapons drawn and notes passed to the teller. He's on the web taking things of value from you and me. So we know that there have been successful attacks on a whole host of corporations, Google, Northrop Grumman, Symantec. This is all one attack, but it hit many companies. The attacks appeared to be from a trusted source. They exploited a vulnerability in Microsoft Explorer. And the attacker gained complete control over the compromised system, including systems used by software developers to build code. Think about the implications that that would have for voting. And the Gmail accounts of Chinese human rights workers. And I believe that the assumption is that this attack came from China. Government vulnerabilities. Again, Mueller said the FBI's computer network has been penetrated and attackers have corrupted data. The former director of the National Intelligence said, in looking at computer systems of consequence in government, Congress, and the Department of Defense, aerospace companies with valuable trade secrets, we've not examine one yet that has not been infected by an advanced persistent threat. So I'm sure you've all heard of the Stuxnet virus, malware that was initially spread via Windows. The software was specialized to attack Siemens industrial software. It targeted the uranium centrifuges that were used, the centrifuges used for uranium enrichment in Iran. It appears to have been developed by the US and Israel, and it was very sophisticated. There was also an attack you might not know about on Canada, where foreign hackers attacked the Canadian government, the Finance Department, Treasury Board, and Defense Research and Development were broken into, and highly classified information was obtained in Canada. So the moral to this story is that election officials and internet voting vendors do not have the resources of the Department of Defense or Google or many of the other countries and companies that have been successfully attacked. So how do election officials expect to defend themselves? How do these internet vendors expect to defend themselves? They don't have those resources either, internet voting vendors. By the way, you should jump in at any point if you want to. So malware on the voters' computers, which again is something I'm sure you are all aware of. Just recently, NIST issued this statement that malware on voters' personal computers pose a serious threat that could compromise the secrecy or integrity of voters' ballots, and the United States currently lacks an infrastructure for secure electronic voter authentication. Now, I'm saying something that you all know, but election officials don't know this. And so it's important that NIST has made this statement. I mean, these are the reason I quote these officials is because election officials don't know what we know. So we again have some nice new malware. Flame is interesting. It only collects data, but that can be pretty important. And of course, the malware itself is so sophisticated, larger than 20 megabytes, 20 times larger than Stuxnet, can take screenshots of online activity, record audio, et cetera, et cetera. You can see what it does. It's just an example of the kinds of things that are out there. And when you think of the problems that Stuxnet and Flame are addressing, they're much harder than a simple problem of changing your vote. That's much, much easier problem. And then, of course, Zeus is my favorite. Zeus, the primary goal of Zeus is to steal money from online bank accounts, but again, it could be easily modified. It can mimic financial statements so that the victim doesn't know that the money's been stolen because the financial statements look the way they're supposed to look, and you basically find out when your check bounces. And we know that over 675 pounds was stolen from about 3,000 customers of some unnamed UK bank. That as of 2009, 3.6 million PCs in the US have been infected. And there's a new credit card verification system scam. Well, it was new when I made this slide. I guess it's a little old now. That was being used to steal personal identifiable information. And when I was over in the UK about a year or so ago, I received a copy of this scam from the Commerce Bank. Now, I should mention, or maybe I do here. Let me see. OK. Anyway, there's a picture of the scam. And it really looks the way it's supposed to. I mean, this looks like something coming from Visa or MasterCard. I don't know how well you can see it. But the point is that this fooled a lot of people. And I was talking about this at Berkeley recently, UC Berkeley. And one of the people asked me, well, but then what do you do if you get email from a bank? How do you know it's legitimate? And of course, the answer is a bank would never send something like this out, because they know about the security issues. If you get something from your bank saying, we need to know your password or something, it's a scam. So basically, what would happen with Zeus is that the banks would cover the loss. So the reason that most people don't know about the threat of Zeus and the money being stolen from online bank accounts, and the reason I'm willing to do banking online, is that I know that if the money is stolen, the bank will cover it quietly, because the banks still come out ahead versus the cost of having to hire more tellers and have more buildings and so on. So they come out ahead by covering the loss. But they do it quietly because they want people to continue using online banking. So as I say, Zeus attacked Charles Schwab. And again, they did it with fake LinkedIn reminders and so on. And they captured vital personal information. So this can also be used for identity theft as well as financial theft. And it's being marketed. You can buy Zeus from the black market. You can get upgrades. You can get specialized software. It's been on several interesting websites, like when Paul McCartney was doing a tour of the United States. It was on his website, and people who would go there to his website would get their computers would get infected. The German Wikipedia was infected at one point, and it avoids its detection by using SSL to communicate with its handler. And the moral of the story is switching votes on voters' computers is a relatively easy problem. Configur's a bit older, but I really like this one as well because it's an example of how you can update, the malware can update itself. People might say, well, how do you know for the next election who's going to be running? Well, you call home for instructions. That's how you know. And again, infected machines can remotely install malicious software without the computer owner's knowledge once the computer's been infected. And one interesting story with Configure is that in 2009, over 300 imaging machines in hospitals were found to have Configure on them, even though these are not supposed to be connected to the internet. And the way it got on there was that the machines would receive updates from the manufacturer via the internet, and they got infected. Now, fortunately, nothing happened, but you can just imagine the risks of having hospital machines being infected by malware. You can also you have to worry about backdoors, hidden election rigging software that allows someone later to insert names. And again, sometimes backdoors are intentional, such as happened with the Sony BMG rootkit, which was distributed in 2005 on millions of music CDs to gather information about users surreptitiously. It was discontinued after it was discovered, and there have been lawsuits, and the affected CDs have been recalled. But this is an example of an intentional backdoor that had not been known about. And something that, I mean, I suspect almost everything I'm saying to everybody in this room is obvious, but it's not obvious to election officials. It's not obvious to most people. And I think the reason why is that people don't understand how software works, and they don't understand how complicated it can be. They don't understand when we say you can't find all the software bugs, why you can't. And one of the arguments I make is that if it were easy to check this voting software and be sure it's secure and accurate and so on, then we wouldn't have major vendors like Microsoft and Apple and lots of other companies sending out periodic updates, many of which are security fixes. That wouldn't be necessary. Major companies would produce perfect software if they could. The problem is they can't because it's too complicated. And again, to try to explain the complexity, the best example I could think of is the US tax code. And for those of you who are familiar with the US tax code, nobody understands it all. And there have been instances of what you might think of as malware installed into the US tax code, where some update to the tax, it's periodically updated. And there have been cases where updates that look perfectly benign have turned out to benefit a single company in ways that had not been anticipated before the update was made. So it was not understood when the update was made. And I think that's as close as I can come to an example of malware that a non-programmer might understand. But I think one of the reasons that we have so many problems with technology, and I know this is an international issue, is that the people who buy the systems, the non-techies, just don't have a grasp of what software is like and what these systems are like. And so I think one of our jobs is to try to explain it to them in ways they can understand.
So are you saying that the major second bullet here has happened? Provisions benefiting a second...
Provisions benefiting a single company? Yes.
Can you list the story for that?
Oh, I used to know that. It had something to do with ceiling fans, I remember. I'd have to go back and look it up. But some company that manufactured ceiling fans got some special tax break. And the way it was written into the code, it wasn't at all obvious that it was benefiting anybody in particular. And I could, if you really want to know, I could find it and send you an email with that information. I just have to do a little research.
Thanks.
I'm really not making that up, but you're right. I should have that at my fingertips. So again, the message over and over is if the voter's computer is infected with an election rigging virus or worm, it's the virus that will be voting, not the voter. And the voter will never know. And again, I think another issue is that the voter thinks, well, I type it here and it's on the screen, so I know what's on the screen is what's being sent out. And again, they don't understand that, that you can have one thing on the screen and quite something else going out over the internet. And that's a difficult concept to get across for some reason. At least I find it difficult. So the distributed denial of service attacks is another way to attack internet voting, and it prevents people from accessing websites. Obviously, a good example for non-techies is when you want to call in a call-in show. You usually can't get in because everyone's calling in, and that's a distributed denial of service attack. Not intentional, but it is denial of service. And it's typically done with botnets that consist of zombies. The FBI has said that the Mariposa botnet may have infected 8 million to 12 million computers internationally. It stole credit cards, data, and online banking passwords. And again, much of this malware has customized versions, and voters could be disenfranchised on election day by selectively disenfranchising groups where you know they're going to vote for the party you don't want to win, for example. Estonia is an example of a country that suffered a massive denial of service attack. It was not done during an election, but it could have been, because they're very wired there. The speculation is that it originated in Russia because of the Estonian decision to move a Soviet war memorial. And as I say, they had earlier had a national parliamentary election where people were allowed to vote over the internet, and that could have been seriously disrupted by a distributed denial of service attack. In Canada, there were distributed, yes?
Do you know how much malware there is on military computers overseas?
I don't know, but I would guess that there's some there.
So they're administered. So the computers that military personnel would use for voting, are these just PCs that people walk up to and work on for a little while?
Well, I mean, fortunately, we don't have widespread internet voting of the military yet. But for example, in 2004, there was a project called SERVE, which was proposing precisely that, to allow military voters to vote over the internet using their PCs, vote from an internet cafe. The only requirement is they had to use Windows machines and had to be a certain level, but not very, the requirements were not very strong, except you couldn't use a Mac. I mean, anybody, you could vote from anywhere. So, yes.
If you believe things you find on the internet, then it was Home Depot that was importing fans from China.
Oh, thank you for getting that.
There was a tariff, and there was a last-minute provision put in to eliminate that tariff. So Home Depot.
Would you send me that link, please?
Sure, if that's the one you're thinking.
Yes, yes. So the keyword was ceiling fans.
Yes, ceiling fans.
Yes, Home Depot.
Taxpayer.
Yes. So the new Democrat, the NDP in Canada is a left-wing party which likes to be really inclusive, and so they wanted to let everybody get involved, all the party members get involved with their leadership vote. And in 2003, they allowed people to vote over the internet, and their voting site was shut down for several hours. Now, we don't know if it was a distributed denial of service attack or if it was the slammer worm, which was also going around then. And we've never found out. The vendor claims to have patched for the slammer worm, but we don't know. There's been no independent examination, nothing. And the NDP, bless them, did it again in 2012. I mean, it's like they didn't learn. They had a second leadership election over the internet, and they suffered a massive denial of service attack. They were so ill prepared for this, and I really find this kind of appalling, that this was going on during their convention. And at the convention, people had to vote on terminals that were scattered around the room. So people who were physically there couldn't vote during this attack because there were no paper ballots. And again, there's been no, I mean, they have acknowledged that they suffered a massive denial of service attack. They have acknowledged that. But there's been no report issued, at least that I've seen and I've been watching. Yeah.
Is the same vendor both times?
No, I think it's a different system. Let me see. In fact, it may have been Everyone Counts. I'm not sure. I'd have to go. It's in the book. Look it up in the book. I think it's in the book. Oh, no, it may not be. No, it's not in the book because this happened after we were finished writing. I'd have to, but I can get that information for you. Yes?
I understand how this could gain somebody if they were denial of service on, I don't know, the people's voting machines or something, but if there's sort of a single server where everyone's voting, how does denial of service, how can someone use that to get the outcome that they want, other than just causing mayhem, which is also bad?
Well, yeah, I mean, but you're saying that you can do selective disenfranchisement with voters' machines, but not necessarily with the server. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm wondering, yeah, if I understand.
Well, yeah, I think that's true. But of course, there are other ways of disenfranchising voters.
But is the denial of service attack on the server, is there a way that they're using that to try to get an outcome that they want, or is it just to cause problems?
Well, in this case, I don't know what the purpose of the denial of service attack was on the NDP in 2012. My guess is that a lot of people never got to vote. Yeah. And it's possible that that influenced the outcome of the race. How it did, I don't know. So, I don't know what the motivation was.
But if they actually wanted to change the outcome, there are plenty of other more effective ways of doing that. So,
right.
Presumably.
Well, of course, they may have done those too.
Well, right.
I mean, I don't know. Maybe someone just wanted to show off. I don't know. Maybe it's someone who didn't like the NDP. I mean, that's certainly possible that so that another political party in Canada did this to make the NDP look foolish. I mean, I could see that as a motivation. But they don't know. That would be nice, though, wouldn't it? But they don't, it's like it didn't, there are still, throughout Canada, there are towns and provinces who are still talking about having internet voting. This seems to have just gone over their heads. And one of the things that happens is that, I'm telling you all these things, much of which I realize you know, but people don't say, they read about Stuxnet and how it attacked the Iranian centrifuges, and they don't say, well, gee, that could happen with internet voting too. Somehow the vendors say what we have is completely secure, trust us, it's okay, and they don't put these things together.
So this is all interesting. I'm just trying to think through why we might still want internet voting. Let's take the example of Amazon. I use my credit card, I buy stuff from Amazon. Visa, Amazon, myself, between the three of us, we've decided this makes sense, despite the risks. So is there some basis some way to think through the internet voting that's still, some reason we might do it anyway?
Well, I buy things from Amazon too, but it's not the same thing as voting, because when you buy a book, as you say, Amazon knows who you are, it knows what you're buying, you know if your book arrives or not. With your vote, it's supposed to be secret. You don't want the election officials to know how you're voting. You don't know if your vote arrived correctly. And there's no way to correct if it doesn't get there. With the book, Amazon can send you another book, but if your vote is lost, there's nothing you can do. So a lot of people make this assumption, I can bank over the internet, or I can buy a book from Amazon over the internet. Why can't I vote over the internet? And the part they don't put together is that voting is a harder problem. And one of the main reasons it's a harder problem is that you have a secret ballot. Some people have said, well, let's get rid of the secret ballot. I personally think that would be a disaster for a whole host of reasons, which we can discuss if you want. But
So what would be the reason in favor of?
In favor? Well, election officials think, we've heard many times this will get young people to vote, because voting's dropping off. So young people, because they're so, internet savvy, if we have internet voting, they'll all vote. We can get more people voting. It'll be cheaper, which isn't necessarily true, by the way. And so these are notions that people have that are not necessarily grounded in any kind of realistic testing. And of course, it's very difficult to test anything over the internet with voting elections, because every election is different. Different people come out to vote. And just because you get more people voting in one election and fewer in another doesn't mean that that's because of technology or the lack of technology. You just can't compare them. They're not the same. But again, there are these myths that are out there, and of course, they're encouraged by the vendors. But there's no substantial scientific evidence, to my knowledge, that supports them.
There's also the military push.
The,
The what?
the military push to.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's been a big push by a branch of the military to have internet voting for military and civilians living abroad. Hopefully that might be changing, we hope. They've been pushing internet voting since 2000. And the SERV project that I mentioned was being pushed by this agency of the military called FVAP, Federal Voting Assistance Program. And they just seem to be staffed with people who think internet voting is great. So that makes our task harder. But that may be changing. Insider threat. Should I go on? So again, it's difficult to discuss this with election officials, but the fact of the matter is there are many different insiders, such as people who write the software, anyone who has access to the main software, or even to computers. We've seen examples where computers have been infected by using, Ed Felton had an example where he showed how to infect computers using just using the card that goes into to set up the ballots and to collect the votes. So basically, anyone who has access can potentially rig an election. And again, as examples of insiders, Jerome Caraviel lost almost $7 billion in unauthorized transactions. And of course, we have CIA agent Aldrich Ames, who was very high level, but who was a traitor. And so we know that there can be insider threats. When money is stolen, or books are stolen, or what have you, secrets or secrets passed, that can be eventually uncovered. But how do you prove an election has been stolen when there's no documentation? Yeah, your question?
How is this new for internet voting? This seems like the same problem with even just the Scantron voting or anything.
Well, the problem of not being able to prove that an election was stolen is the case whenever there's no paper. I mean, certainly with these paperless touchscreen machines, I agree.
I mean the entire insider threat. I mean the...
Well, no, because if you have a system that can be audited or recounted, if you have, for example, well, let me put it this way. If you've got corrupted election officials, I think it's almost impossible to have a completely secure election if people are really corrupted, if they're determined. Maybe your system would work, I don't know. But in general, it's impossible if you've got corrupted insiders. One thing with internet voting versus other kinds of voting is that the attacks can come from anywhere, of course. And that's a big difference. Now, that doesn't necessarily change the insider threat, but in general.
Sure. I just meant with respect to insider threats, it seems like just as bad. I mean, the people who made the Scantron machines could have whatever.
You're right.
Obviously. So,
you're right. You're right. It is. So insider threat is a problem with most voting systems, but certainly when there's nothing that can be audited. So the argument that we are all making is that we need accountability. We know that computer software can be buggy or might contain malicious code or a whole host of other things can happen. Open source, and I should probably say public source because you clearly don't want people changing the software. So public source is I think, a good thing as opposed to secret software. But it's not adequate because, as we all know, public source can also be subverted. And of course, the system used in DC was open source or public source, and that was hacked. Again, because the votes are secrets, basically, in general, I can't verify that my vote was accurately received and counted over the internet. So I just thought I'd mention Estonia, because Estonia is a very wired country. And it's frequently brought up as an example of how internet voting works, because they've been doing internet voting there for quite some time. And the number of people participating has increased with each election. So at the last election in 2011, 24% of the votes were cast over the internet. I was actually invited to Estonia last year by the mayor of Tallinn, who is the head of the Center Party. The Center Party, which was came in second in the 2011 election, believes that the election was rigged. They believe that because they didn't do as well on the internet portion of the election as they did on the non-internet portion. Now, maybe it was rigged, Maybe it wasn't rigged. I mean, it might, the center party consists of a lot of Russians who are living in Estonia or former Russians, a lot of older people. They're probably less likely to vote over the internet, or they may be less likely to vote over the internet. So it's quite possible that this differential can be explained legitimately, or maybe not, or maybe it's some of both. Maybe there was this difference and there was some rigging. We don't know. And that's the problem, is that we don't know. The center party cannot prove that the election was rigged, and the party that won cannot prove that it was not rigged, because it's impossible to conduct a post-election recount or audit to prove that everything was done properly. Furthermore, what I learned when I was there was that the project manager could update the software with no oversight. And so I was saying, well, let's bring in outside experts. And they said, sure, bring in outside experts, that's fine, but they're going to have to sign a non-disclosure agreement before they can view the code. And the outside experts who were willing to do this were unwilling to sign an NDA because they wanted to be able to speak openly if they uncovered some problem. So there's been no independent review of the code. But I just want to mention the fact that that the manager could access the software with no oversight is a glaring security hole, glaring. And I'm not accusing him of anything. I mean, I think he's probably a really decent guy and trying to do the right thing, but this should never be allowed, independent of who it is. So in summary, you must be able to audit and recount. Ballots sent over the internet are unreliable, therefore a recount is meaningless. So we have to have paper ballots and mandatory audits where you randomly select ballots afterwards to be recounted. And again, this is just not directly related to internet voting, but what most of us are looking for is what we call risk-limiting audits, where by using statistical methods you can reduce the number of ballots that have to be looked at in order to convince yourself that the election results were correct. We don't think that you have to get the precise exact numbers that everybody got. What we really should be concerned about is that the correct people were the winners. So as opposed to that they got, you don't need it down to the least significant digit or anything like that. You just want to make sure the correct people won. And so again, closeness of the election is a factor. And you just keep on with this audit until you're able to convince yourself that the right people won. Oh, and that's the book. So we don't need to stop there, but that's basically it. So I hope there's some questions. I hope there's some questions or comments.
I want to ask more about Estonia and the dispute from the centre party. So I read a report from Robert Crimmins Group, whose name I've forgotten. OSCE, which says that they complained because they considered that it was sort of inherently manipulable because we can get evidence that your vote was cast in a way that it was intended. And it's also said, so the end of the report says, by the way, they tried to bring it to the Supreme Court of Estonia, but it was thrown out because it was cast too late, and they declared that they were going to take it to the European Court of Justice. I'm not sure I have a specific question. Maybe just expand and tell me more about what the dispute was and what happened.
Well, actually, I think the initial complaint was brought by a graduate student in Estonia who's not a computer scientist. I think he's a historian or something, yeah. And he looked at this and said, wow, this is insecure. Well, I have to say, he's obviously done he's messed with computers. He knew something about what he was doing. And he wrote up a complaint, and again, and I believe it was rejected, and I don't remember, I actually have this written up, so I don't remember if the details were that they felt it was irrelevant or whatever, but at some point time became an issue and they said it's past time when you can complain, and they threw it out.
To demonstrate that there had been any fraud, perhaps.
That may be, I could actually, I can double check and tell you. I have it, I just don't have it at my fingertips. But basically, it was not, I think it was not taken seriously, quite frankly. And I think the people running the country don't want to acknowledge that there could have been a problem in the election. And again, I think this is not unique to Estonia. I think we see this all over, where election officials don't want people raising questions about election outcomes for several reasons. First of all, they don't want to be challenged, but also they're afraid that this will make voters not trust the democracy or the leadership, and it might discourage people from voting. One of the things that we constantly get told is because you're raising these issues, people won't go to vote because they think their votes won't count. Yes. And frankly, that's a concern of mine because I don't want to discourage people from voting. And what I would generally say is, yes, we've got these problems, but if you want to make sure your vote won't count, don't vote. You know, I mean, if you want your vote to count, you must go vote. So, but that is an issue. And my guess is that, after all, the people running Estonia are the people who won the election, so they don't have a whole lot of motivation to cast doubt on the election.
How widespread is the belief among the supporters of the Centre Party that
The election was rigged? I don't know because, you know, I don't speak Estonian. And the people I talked to felt that, but they were the leaders. Plus the student. Well, I mean, the student wasn't saying he thought it was rigged. What he was saying was that it is fundamentally insecure. And it might have been rigged, but he was not making that accusation. It was the leadership of the party who were saying that. Yeah.
I want to go back to this question. So in the current voting system, we accept some amount of risk. Like here in Washington now, we have to vote by mail.
Which is a terrible idea.
I agree. So I have to believe that the mailman isn't throwing my ballot away because he knows what area of Seattle I come from. I have to trust that the Scantron machine that scans it does the right thing. I have to believe that they didn't pre-stuff it with some ballots. There's a lot of trust going along, right?
There are some minor things. You can check online to see whether King County claims to have received your ballot. So that does get around the,
okay, so I get around the mailman problem.
But just that one little piece.
Okay, so there's a variety of things. So it seems, but the reason why I still feel for myself relatively confident, partially because I haven't thought about it as much, but I guess is because the damage that any one person can do seems a little bit more limited. And I'm wondering if that's one of the big differences with internet voting is that what one person or organization can do is magnified.
Oh, absolutely. Well, basically, with the introduction of computers, that's also the case. Once you get computers in, if you can get malware into the computers that are counting the ballots,
right,
that magnifies the potential as well. And but by the way, I think what you should be doing is trying to change the system in Washington State because there are lots of security issues with just vote by mail.
So I mean, to the coercion question, I always wondered this also because I thought originally the whole point of the voting system was to not allow coercion. And as soon as you allow mail-in votes, you allow coercion, right?
That's right.
So this seems kind of odd. I mean,
I think it's terrible.
That's a problem in general, right? I mean, anywhere that mail-in, it's not just because it's only mail-in, it's as soon as you allow mail-in at all, coercion.
As soon as it's remote. I mean, the beauty of polling place voting, at least the way it used to be, is you'd go in and you could draw a curtain. Now, I guess with computers these days, they don't necessarily have curtains anymore. But, you know, ideally, you should be able to go in someplace, draw a curtain, and vote where nobody can see what you're doing.
Not just that you could, you had to.
Well, that was the lever machines, but not everybody had lever machines. Yeah.
But they probably also would require only one person at a booth at a time.
Oh, of course.
Stuff, right? So, I mean,
Unless, except in the case of people with disabilities, they would sometimes. But that was an issue too, of course. Yeah.
So Mexico recently had an election where they do classic, you might consider classic voting, where you go into a voting booth. I know people claim that election was rigged too, because although no one was coercing you, one of the parties was giving you $50 if you, when you went into the voting booth, you took a picture of your phone with your phone of your ballot, and then they would, when you came out, they would give you $50. Just a counterexample for that particular issue. My question in general is, lots of things wrong with electronic voting. How do we know electronic voting is fundamentally less safe than traditional voting?
Well, it depends on what you mean by electronic voting. So I mean, but there, you know, to me, electronic voting means there's a computer involved. But maybe that's not what you have in mind. Do you mean internet?
Internet voting. Then.
Internet. Why? Okay, so the question is, why is internet voting less safe? Because it can be basically, you can rig an election. Anyone from anywhere can rig the election. In Mexico, if they did what you're saying, somebody had to be there passing out the money. There was the risk of being caught. Now, maybe things are so corrupt in Mexico that no one worried very much about that. I don't know. Again, if the system is fundamentally corrupt, it's really hard to think of a kind of voting that would defeat that.
I think I would argue that the verifiable systems can't prevent denial of service, but they can tell you, even if there's been an insider attack, you will know.
You mean with paper? Yeah, but the the coercion, or I mean, or if you've got, I mean, it's a very hard problem. And so you're saying the verifiable could prevent insider attacks?
Yeah, absolutely. And they can't prevent the insiders from destroying the data.
Exactly.
Not completing the election, but you can tell whether the election was completed correctly or not.
Well, I think it depends on what system you're using. Now, again, the system that you're working on, maybe that's true. But in general, for most systems, you could, for example, lose paper ballots or do ballot box stuffing. I mean, there are issues that, I mean, it's a hard problem to get it right.
Absolutely.
When you've got insider corruption. It's a very hard problem. So what we're focusing on is trying to come up with ways of doing things such that if everything works right, it should be, I mean, you have backup, it's correct, and minimizing the risks. So if you've got corrupt insiders, that's a really hard problem. But in most cases, hopefully you don't. But there could still be major risks if you use the wrong kinds of technology, or if you use technology wrongly. So we're trying to eliminate unnecessary risks. There are some risks that are very hard to eliminate for any system. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm just sort of trying to think of it at a high level, whether it's really, I mean, to some extent, it's easier to study risks of computer systems because it's easily replicable, and we can write papers about how these things can be hacked, and we can have 20 slides about terrifying but hilarious things that happened on previous attempts. Whereas if I try to publish a paper about, well, it turns out I had this guy come into the lab and he had his and I wanted him to vote some way, and I had the billy club out, and it turns out he changed his vote when I held up my billy club, right?
Mm-hmm.
That sort of paper doesn't really get published, right? Because I don't know, it's much harder to do that type of research. It's much harder to do the type of research on traditional voting systems than it is on electronic. So we have sort of less evidence that type of voting is risky.
Well, in terms of the example you gave, and maybe that's not being fair to you, but in terms of that example, what you're talking about is trying to impact individual voters, and so that's kind of like a retail sort of fraud. And I think a big difference is once you introduce computers into the process, you can have wholesale fraud. You can have much more widespread fraud. I mean, people can still be bribed. There's nothing you can do about that. You may have problems with verification, although I agree the cell phone's a nice way to check. And that's a problem. How do you prevent that? That's something we actually talked about talking about at the meeting. We didn't, the conference we were just at. But you could at least have a law which says this kind of behavior is illegal, and if you catch any evidence that this is going on, you can prosecute someone. So there's some risk, and if someone has to be physically nearby in order to pay the person off, that person is running the risk of being arrested. Whereas, if you're off in Romania or who knows where, rigging an American election over the internet, that's very low risk.
Isn't the adversary here typically one of the political parties which has large numbers and has a large amount of resources?
It could be, but there could be lots of adversaries. I mean, there certainly, as far as the U.S. election is concerned, I imagine. I mean, I certainly can. There are many interested parties, right? One is clearly the political parties. And when you look at how much money is being spent in this upcoming election, which is really horrifying, a teeny fraction of that would be a very handsome amount of money to pay as a bribe to someone. And if that someone had access to software that controls machines or internet voting, anything involving computers that impact a large number of people, that could change the outcome. And quite frankly, it's something I worry about.
So, using internet voting will cause some probability of the vote of the wrong person winning because there is undetected fraud.
Right.
Not using it will cause some probability of the wrong person winning because young people and people confined to their homes didn't vote. At what percentage of disenfranchisement of young people does it tip the balance?
Well, it's not clear that the internet would necessarily cause more.
It's not clear, but what percentage would convince you that?
Well, I don't know how you quantify it, because how do you quantify stolen elections? How do you determine?
Well, I want to compare stolen election to stolen election. I want to
Well, no,
compare the wrong person winning.
Well, somebody not voting isn't the same thing as stealing an election. They're different. Now you're saying the outcome might be the same. Is that what you're saying?
I just mean the wrong person wins. The person who a plurality of the.
Well, I don't know. You're getting into a lot of, it's sort of, I mean,
I'm trying to figure out a way to compare them.
Personally, I think the fact that we don't have universal suffrage in this country is appalling. If we had universal suffrage, the outcomes of a lot of elections in the past 20 or 30 years would have changed. I mean, just the fact, and this is not related to my talk, but something I learned about in writing the book when I did the chapter on voter registration, the whole history of felon disenfranchisement is shocking. I mean, felon disenfranchisement was invented in the South after the Civil War to keep the former slaves from voting. And it's still used to keep pretty much the same population from voting. And sometimes it's blatant. And if you look at the percentage of people who have been disenfranchised simply by felon disenfranchisement, it's huge compared to the closest of elections we've had recently.
So you're saying that a better solution than internet voting would be universal suffrage, and I agree that would be a better way to solve the problem.
Well, I think it'd be. I mean, it's better in so many ways. Yeah, yeah.
Like Australia. I assume you're.
No, I'm not saying. I'm not saying it should be mandatory, because that has. I don't know how I feel about that.
I thought you were talking about mandatory as
No,
well as
universal is not the same thing as mandatory, right? We don't have universal suffrage in this country.
Right. But I thought you were talking about one way you could get rid of the effect of disenfranchisement of the lack of internet voting is by making voting mandatory, and that would.
I think that there are ways short of mandatory where you can make it much easier for people to vote. I mean, the fact that it's done on a weekday. I mean, there are all kinds of steps that can be taken that can facilitate voting, early voting. Again, there's security issues with early voting. I don't know why we know it's done on a Tuesday because of history about when this country used to be farming country, and that they didn't want to have it interfering with the market day and stuff like that. I mean, there are things that are done in the United States today which are like 17th or 18th century stuff. And one is, maybe 19th century, the way we run our elections. If you look at just how the elections are run and the lack of national standards and requirements and the things that happen from state to state and locality to locality, it's really shocking. And people aren't talking about it. But our democracy is not built on a very sound structure right now because of the way we run elections. So I think it's a whole host of things. Internet voting, there's this move among some people to try to get the newest and shiniest and brightest thing to say, we've got the best stuff, we're really ahead of the game, see how advanced we are. And internet voting is one such example. And yet we know that internet voting is a terrible idea. We've got to get that message out. So that's really why I talk about it. But all these other issues are really important. I mean, as a computer scientist, I can't really talk extensively about voter disenfranchisement because that's not my realm, and because it's become so highly politicized. What I can talk about is voter registration databases, which is a technical issue, and where people are, again, ignoring the technology. I mean, there was, can I talk? One of the things that actually David Dill, who is the founder of Verified Voting, found out a couple of weeks ago was that in Washington State, a nice way to disenfranchise someone is, it turns out you can, over the internet and by looking at the voter registration information, obtain enough personally identifying information about a voter to go to a website and change that voter's address without the voter's knowledge or consent. The state currently does not do one of the obvious things that we recommended in our study, which was done back in 2006. This is an ACM study, to send out a postcard or something to someone to the old address when the address has been changed to make sure that there was no fraud. So this does not happen in Washington State right now. Hopefully that's going to change before the election, hopefully. But meanwhile, you can do, again, it's retail, but you can do retail fraud by simply having people's ballots sent to the wrong address. And they won't know, because no one is telling them. I mean, that's the level of detail where things get, I mean, you know, how can they do this, you'd say, but, and just.
Well, I want to offer what may be a more specific answer to your question. I don't remember if you were at the Yokohama Summit about a year ago, but Bob Carey just left as the director of the Federal Voting Assistance Program. He was enormously concerned about the level of participation of military voters being much lower than the public at large. And looking for, asking almost exactly the question that you asked about, well, we're not getting the right results about that. How do you quantify the differences? And he asked for specific quantification of risks due to internet voting from major researchers. Ron Rivest and David Wagner were both explicitly asked to come talk about quantifying the risks. And they both came and they tried very hard to do as careful an analysis as possible. They gave sort of back-to-back talks where independently they basically said, the risk is unbounded, that we can't put any upper limit on this.
Yeah, those are good talks too.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, I mean, there are a variety of ways in which one can mess up an election, wholesale and retail, and I just gave you a retail one here. But internet voting is wholesale.
Is there another question? Or should I ask my final comments?
There is, I just had one comment. You earlier said, why would somebody use a denial of service attack who would be motivated? And I was thinking that it probably is possible to turn an election with a denial of service attack if you time it to be when a particular sector of the electorate that you don't want to vote.
You're absolutely right. I should have thought of that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good response.
And Al, this thing about Washington database, which I can talk to you more about later if you want, but Washington is a relatively blue state. Washington minus King County is a pretty red state. Yeah. It would be easy to do a denial of service to King County voters to have a major effect on the state's outcome. The voter rolls, which are public and open, say exactly who you are, what county you live in, and give all the information you need to change the addresses.
And with computers, maybe it can be made more wholesale.
It can be done from overseas, outside of your jurisdiction.
So you had one.
So, okay, so my difficult question, and feel free to wait till the cameras are off to answer if you'd rather, but this is a theoretical question because everything you said about internet voting I agree with completely, but I'm trying to get at, is it absolutely fundamental, or is there any possibility that there's any kind of widespread network that looks something like the internet, but perhaps completely re-architected a century from now, could allow voting that is as secure as postal voting, vote by mail, other remote voting methods?
Well, obviously, it's not such a hard question to answer because as a scientist, I can't say it's impossible unless there's an impossibility proof, and I haven't seen one. So obviously, I can't say it's impossible. And as you say, the standard should be as secure as remote voting, any kind of remote voting, vote by mail being the canonical example. I know, you know, there are attempts being made to do that, and maybe one will succeed. I suspect that something that will be needed is similar to what I believe it's Finland, is it, that's doing it, where they have another channel for verifying. I think it's Finland. It's one of those countries. Norway, thank you. Yeah. Where they have another channel for verifying your vote, where you basically can call back on your cell phone. I mean, because you can't be sure that what you see on your internet is correct, on your computer is correct. So my guess is if anything does work, and by the way, they don't claim to be completely secure either, but at least they're aware of the issues. So I think anything that would work would require another channel of communication independent of the channel that you use to communicate your vote on. That's just a conjecture. I think there may be a theorem there. I'd like to think there might be.
Well, thank you very much, Bob.